Well, it's that time of year again. Time to jump back into Splinter Cell. Last time, I discussed Pandora Tomorrow. Pandora Tomorrow was a solid sequel that added new gameplay mechanics whilst also improving on the design of the original Splinter Cell. The OG Splinter Cell is still a solid game, but there are some design decisions which haven't stood the test of time and hurts replay value. Luckily, Pandora Tomorrow was both a commercial and critical success, just like the first game, so of course, there would be another game. Surprisingly, the next game wouldn't be too far away, as Chaos Theory was announced at E3 2004, just a couple months after the release of Pandora Tomorrow. The game itself would release on the 21st of March 2005, almost an exact year after Pandora Tomorrow. Despite only releasing a year later, Chaos Theory received universal acclaim and sold 2.5 million copies by the end of March. To this day, Chaos Theory is considered to be the best game in the series, and is considered to be one of the best stealth games ever made, up there with the Metal Gear Solid games. But the game is also 15 years old, and with me being a big fan of the series, I think it's about time I take a look back on this fan favourite. Right, so before we start, I just wanted to inform you of how I'm handling this video. In my previous Splinter Cell videos, I went through each mission of the game explaining the positives and negatives, as well as the story. However, 2 years later I've realised this structure doesn't really work, and so from here on out, I will be going back to my usual way of critiquing other games, just so the video is more concise. Should also be noted that this video will only be discussing the single player campaign, as the co-op and multiplayer servers were shut down years ago. Anyway, let's get on with the actual video itself. Unlike other videos, I'm going to cover the story before I cover the gameplay. Chaos Theory takes place in 2007, 1 year after Pandora Tomorrow. The plot in the game revolves around World War III being provoked by Doug Shetland. Yeah, that random dude from Pandora Tomorrow is the villain in this game. He's working with Otomo, who is trying to change Japan's new law where they can't strike outside their own country, and is trying to use South Korea and North Korea missiles to attack Japan. That's the basic story, which works fine. The story in these games serve more as context for the gameplay and the levels you play in, so it's best to keep it simple. The characters are all really cool, and it's always fun to hear Sam and Grimm's back and forth about his growing age.
The lobby. It looks like a laser grid just came online.
Lasers. Lasers are so...
90s?
I was gonna say 70s. Can you please stop making me feel old?
Got bad news for you, Sam. You are old.
Sam always has a dry sense of humor when interrogating enemies.
Something going on with the ventilation system?
Oh! Hey, who are you?
Pretend I'm Harry Tuttle.
Who?
I'm an ill-tempered and heavily armed heating engineer who's asking questions about your ventilation system.
I guess it's not working properly since the blackout.
So it shouldn't take much to shut down that big fan if I wanted to.
I don't know. Why would you want to do that?
The adventure, the travel.
Hey, you okay?
And Lambert is always level-headed and tries to think things through before jumping to conclusions.
We're back at the brink of war, and now we find out it is the Japanese?
The Japanese are allies.
I don't care if they're the Christmas elves. They sank the Walsh.
We don't know that their government was involved.
We know Admiral Otomo was involved, and we know where the gentleman is. We have to go in now, immediately.
The fact is, we don't know how far the conspiracy goes. If Otomo's actions are sanctioned by the Japanese government, then the only solution is military. But if he's acting alone...
Your man again?
He's already in position.
There is this new guy Redding, but he doesn't really get anything to do in the game, so he's not very memorable. Doug Shetland works as an antagonist. His motivation for trying to start World War III is that the status quo for the world isn't good enough and that things need to start over.
We've been fighting their dirty little wars our entire lives, and where do we end up? Staring at each other down the barrels of our guns. Nothing has changed, Bishop. And it won't change by degrees. We have to tear it down and start over. It's the only way.
Your own little chaos theory, throw the world into war and hope that what comes out the other side is better.
It will be better. Because this war will change things, Sam. Every other war has been about keeping things the same, but the status quo doesn't work anymore. America's sick, Sam. She's dying. The politicians, the bureaucrats, the whispered backroom deals, it's all life support for a sick old lady who was dead a long time ago.
By comparison, Otomo is a pretty weak villain. His motives are understandable, but he never gets any development outside of it. Besides, the last mission doesn't really work as well as it should. The mission itself is fine, but it comes after the confrontation with Shetland, which was a great climax for everything that led to that point. But the game is just like, nope, we have one more mission. I think what they could have done was switch the order of these two missions around and make the confrontation with Shetland the ending. It's not that the final mission is bad or weak, it's just that the game already hit a climactic peak with the mission beforehand, and thus the next mission just feels like busy work instead of a climactic ending to the game. Other than that, I think the story works well overall. Each mission progresses the plot in a meaningful way, the actors turn in great performances, especially Michael Ironside, and the cutscenes are just really entertaining overall. So yeah, I think the story is pretty damn solid. Right, now let's get into the meat of Splinter Cell. Chaos Theory fixes pretty much every problem from the previous games, whilst also adding new elements to the gameplay, which allow for more creativity. A common complaint I had with the first two games was that going non-lethal was never as rewarding as going lethal, since the game lacked a lot of non-lethal options. In Chaos Theory though, you have almost as much non-lethal options as lethal options. You still have the same gadgets from the previous games, but in more quantity, so unless you're overusing gadgets like an idiot, then you'll always have some gadgets at your disposal to get through encounters without killing anyone. That's not to say the lethal approach isn't useful, it's still just as fun as in the previous games, but it's nice that players who don't want to be vicious, cold-blooded murderers have more options now. Besides, there are only 2 missions out of the 10 where you can't kill anyone, and due to the increased amount of options, these missions don't feel like a slog to get through and are actually very fun. Not to mention that the level design is a big improvement. Another issue I had with the first 2 games is that there are some levels where there's only one true way to play, and any deviation would either result in a mission failure, or make the mission so much harder on yourself that it isn't really worth trying a different way. In Chaos Theory though, there is always a bare minimum of 2 ways to progress through areas, and even more when you take into account the whole level. This also helps for replay value since you can play through each level multiple times and still experience them in different ways. The levels all have multiple floors and rooms, and is complex overall, but it never feels overly complex. And there is a map system, which tells you where your next objective is, so you'll never get too lost when exploring the levels, and if you do, it's your own fault. Speaking of which, the variety of locations in this game is great, and each mission has a unique style. Whether it be a lighthouse, a ship, a bank, rooftops and apartments, an office building, an underground facility, a Japanese bathhouse, yada yada. What is also cool is that each mission has its own unique music. it just helps the levels have their own identity. The game has also added side objectives to levels which motivate you to explore them more, as it will increase your rating at the end of a level. So, the level design is overall great. In terms of new mechanics, Sam has a knife which can be used to kill enemies quickly and efficiently, and can be used to break locks and cut through material, which helps you move around quicker. Plus, it makes him look very intimidating when interrogating someone. Another issue fixed from the previous games is how enemies discovered bodies. In the previous games, bodies would be discovered even if all the enemies in the area had been taken out. In Chaos Theory, however, bodies have to be physically discovered by other enemies, meaning that hiding them isn't required in order to remain stealthy, but it is still recommended. Speaking of the enemies, they are much tougher in this game. Their AI now recognizes anything out of place. If you leave a door open, they will notice. If you leave a light on or off in a room where it was in the opposite state, they will notice. If you hack a keypad instead of using the correct code, they will notice. If you grab someone they're talking to mid-conversation, they will notice. You get the idea. While you now have more options in the missions, the enemies are much smarter now to combat that. If they notice anything out of the ordinary, they will notice and investigate, which makes them a more interesting challenge as the game is reacting to you not being careful, though their peripheral vision still isn't very good.
Am I seeing things?
Also, if they do notice anything out of the ordinary, then they will bring either a flare or a flashlight, which makes hiding in the dark much harder for you. So yeah, the AI for the enemies is improved greatly in this game. Another change is that the game doesn't have a mission failure if you get spotted. Instead, getting spotted will just make the mission harder, since the enemies will have more defenses now that they are aware of your presence, which does punish the player for messing up, but it isn't a big fuck you like it was in the previous games.
Don't tell me. 3 alarms and the mission is over?
Of course not. This is no video game, Fisher.
There is now an EMP thingy on Sam's pistol, which allows you to temporarily shut down lights for a short while without destroying them. Another cool element is this sound meter. It registers how much sound you are making, as well as the sound in the world itself. In the previous games, it was hard to tell if the speed I was walking at was too fast, and if I was making too much noise taking out the lights. But now, thanks to this sound meter, I can easily see if I'm being too loud. Also, one of my complaints with the 2 previous games was that the bloom on the guns was a bit much. I still think it is, however there is a foregrip attachment for the SC20K, which helps stabilize the crosshair, so that helps. And one of my favorite additions to the game is the scoring system at the end of a level. To get 100% on the level, you have to complete all objectives, never get spotted, no bodies can be found, and you can't kill anyone. You can still knock people out, but the game wants you to be somewhat of a pacifist. This is great as it encourages the player to get better at the game and explore more of what the levels have to offer. You can still play the game however you want to and finish the level, but if you want to go for an extra challenge to get 100%, then you'll have to handicap yourself, which makes for a fun challenge. Even if it doesn't always work. There are some sections where you are all but forced into being spotted, and it can make getting 100% runs tedious at times, but it's still a great way to encourage the player to get better at the game. The only real issue I have, and it's more of a nitpick at this point, is that the controls aren't 100% fluid. Don't get me wrong, they're a huge improvement over the previous game, and they do work 9 times out of 10, but then there is that one time where they just don't do what you want them to. But in terms of actual criticisms I have of the game, I don't really have any. Pretty much all the issues I had with the previous 2 games has been fixed here. So, in other words, Splinter Cell Chaos Theory is an almost perfect game in terms of gameplay. The levels are very complex with lots of ways to play through them without overloading you with too much. The enemies pose a great challenge for you because of how aware of the level and your actions they are. Sam himself has been buffed so that he is not only more efficient at taking down enemies in whatever way you choose, but also has the tools to do it properly now. Pretty much every problem that stopped the previous games from being masterpieces has been fixed, and the game encourages you to get better at the game with the ratings at the end. Not to mention, that all this gives the game an insane amount of replay value, and it's why people like myself still go back to this game 15 years later. So yeah, Chaos Theory's gameplay is practically perfect. In conclusion, Splinter Cell Chaos Theory is a masterpiece and arguably the best stealth game ever made. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that it's one of the best video games ever made. Chaos Theory took two solid games and fixed the problems they both had, whilst adding to the formula. It's no wonder that this game has the reputation it does, and why it's the fan favourite in the series. While the series did continue after Chaos Theory, many seem to agree that none of the future games reached its level, which is a shame. But for once, it is nice to see a video game trilogy where each game gets successively better than the last. Double Agent came out a year later to mixed reception, but I'll talk about that game next year. For now, all I can say is that Chaos Theory is more than worth your time, especially if you're a stealth game fan. It's no wonder why it's considered a classic 15 years later.